Hello and welcome to the Permaculture Podcast with Scott Mann, a listener-supported program. My guest for this episode is Stephen Barstow, author of Around the World in 80 Plants. Today we talk about his incredibly diverse garden in Norway, where he grows over 2,000 edible plants in a rather small space. We begin with his background and how he came to have an interest in edibles, from his beginning as a foraging vegetarian through to his collecting and eating a variety of plants from wherever he traveled. He shares with us his love of edible ornamentals, or what Stephen calls edimentals, and he also recommends some of these edimentals to start with, when first beginning to introduce more of these species to your garden. One of my favorites, not mentioned in this interview, are nasturtiums. Let's hear from Stephen, and then I'll join you afterwards with some thoughts and updates. Could you give us a bit of your biography and background, how you came to do what you're doing, and then we'll discuss your book, Around the World in 80 Plants.
Right. Well, I actually moved from the UK to Norway in 1981, which is a hell of a long time ago, 34 years. And I moved to Norway basically to get a job. I am trained as an oceanographer and work with ocean waves. And at that time, Maggie Thatcher was closing all the research institutes in the UK, and just to get a job, I had to move abroad. Well, I could have got a job, but it was within researching dumping of nuclear waste in the deep ocean, and it wasn't really my kind of thing. As at that time, I was going out on marches against nuclear power stations, so it didn't really suit me. But so I moved to Norway in '81, and I was a vegetarian. And at that time, there were very few vegetables available in supermarkets in Norway. The local supermarket had 4 or 5 different vegetables. It was almost as though this was a country where vegetables were illegal. I kind of joke about it, but it was almost like that. And historically, Norwegians haven't had a very strong tradition of using greens at all. So actually, to survive as a vegetarian, I had to start growing food, and we rented a flat with actually a very, very large piece of land that we were able to use. We only stayed there for a couple of years when I moved to where I'm living today. And very early on, I came in contact with a group called the Norwegian Useful Plant Society. And this is a pretty unique society globally, actually. I haven't come across another country that has a society which is devoted to foraging. And this is a very old society here in Norway. It goes back over 100 years, and it's devoted to foraging fungi, mushrooms in the autumn, and berries, of course, but also wild edible greens in the springtime. So there was this kind of strange contrast. There were no vegetables in the supermarket, but there was this group of were youngsters at the time going out on spring forages, and I soon learned there was something like 60 different edible plants in the area around my house. And got really interested in that, and I kind of travelled quite a lot with my work as an oceanographer. We had a kind of a dreamlike project in the South Pacific, actually. I was working with ocean wave energy, and we were trying to work out how much energy there was in the oceans around the South Pacific Islands, because this was an area where they use diesel for fuel, and renewables was something that would help out in that situation, which entailed I had to go down there to do training for some of the islanders in the area. And on these trips around the world, I started stopping off in North America and New Zealand and various places like this, and buying up books about local foraging. Because I saw that there were some really good wild plants that I would never have heard of locally if I hadn't got into local foraging. And it occurred to me that there were, other parts of the world, there would be some other very interesting wild edibles. So I started building up a kind of a library of edible plants. Then I remember one particular time I was in Seattle in the States, and I found this book in a bookstore there called The Edible Plants of the World, Stuart Avant's Edible Plants of the World. It was a book that was put together in about 1920, and it has something like 3,000 wild species which are edible. I thought, wow, this is really interesting. No pictures, just a load of information about each of the plants. And I remember going through this and saying, well, that'd be nice to try. And then I noticed some of the plants that were mentioned in there were actually ornamentals in our gardens. plants like hostas and daylilies and such like. So I started looking around in gardens and botanical gardens and seeing in a slightly new light these ornamental plants, which a few years ago I dubbed edimentals, edible ornamentals, which is also the name of my website, edimentals.com, that these plants were particularly useful because they double up as edibles and ornamentals. So you can forget having an ornamental garden, you can just grow nice plants which are also good to eat. And many of these you can basically cut right down to you can pick the young shoots in the springtime, and then still they will flower later in the season, so you can have both. So that was really the early years.
Were you foraging and kind of eating your way around the world as you would travel, learning about these different edible plants?
To a certain extent. Obviously, I didn't have that much time when I was traveling, but I certainly went out on field trips and started to learn the plants. I remember there was one particular plant in New Zealand that I was very inquisitive to learn more about. It's actually a weed globally. It's a sow thistle, Sonchus. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a weed you basically find in disturbed ground globally. It's actually an annual. But the Maori of New Zealand, they had this perennial sow thistle, and when the Europeans came, there was this annual sow thistle, which I think is familiar to most people, which started appearing in their vegetable gardens, and they started using that one instead of the perennial variant, and it would kind of grow on the edges of their beds. And I read in this foraging book from New Zealand that the Maoris even that they cultivated it said, and that this sow thistle was also sold on markets, in Maori markets in Auckland and various other cities in New Zealand. So when I was back in New Zealand, I decided to visit one of these Maori markets, and right enough, about a third of the stalls on this market, they were selling this, what we would think of as a weed. And it turns out that the Maori use a lot of this sow thistle as a vegetable. It's very, very popular. And it turns out that the Maori have a very low incidence of stomach cancers and other similar cancers, and one of the theories is actually that one of the reasons for this is the large consumption of this weed, whereas the European people they don't really use this plant to any degree. So I remember when I was in New Zealand, I went to this market and I bought some, and I had a kind of accommodation with cooking facilities, and I cooked it up, and wow, this is really quite good. So today, actually one of the vegetables I use most in my garden is actually this common sow thistle, which is a weed on my vegetable and perennial beds in the garden. So very easy. It just you don't do anything; it just keeps on coming. But also, I grow various perennial sow thistles because perennials most wild edibles are actually perennial, and many of our common conventional food crops were originally perennial. Plants like all the cabbage family derive from perennial wild plants. I talk quite a lot about that in the book. There's a whole section about perennial kales and cabbages. 150 years ago, there were perennial kales and cabbages were quite commonly cultivated, but it really didn't fit into our desire to dig the ground, to dig and plough every springtime. But luckily, these perennial kales survived in home gardens across Europe and North America and in some other parts of the world. So luckily, thanks to the fact that home gardeners saw the use of these plants, we have something like, 8 or 9 different old perennial kales which survive today. And thanks to increased interest now in permaculture and perennial vegetables and genetic resources, then I think most of these old perennial kales are now safe. Unlike conventional cabbages and kales, etc., these perennial kales are propagated by cuttings, so they're very easy to just pass over to your neighbour. You don't need any big seed companies as a source of seed.
When making the selections that you did for your book, these 80 plants, you kind of take us on a tour of every continent. Were there particular criteria you had in selecting the plants that you wanted to share?
Well, first of all, they're all plants that I've grown myself in my garden. Well, quite near the Arctic Circle in Norway, living at about 64 degrees north. So these were all plants that I was familiar with and had grown for a number of years. That a lot of the plants have an interesting ethnobotanic story behind them. Yield was one thing. Many of the plants I talk about are plants which grow very well in shady conditions, places where you wouldn't consider to have conventional vegetables. So they fit very well into this new wave of forest gardening, which is coming at us. I mean, I gardened here in Norway more or less on my own for 25 years. I didn't know any other gardeners. And this is before there was, the internet really took off. And it's really only the last 5 years that I've had a lot of contact with other gardeners through the internet, through Facebook and through my website, etc. And that's been really inspiring because there's suddenly this wave over the last 4 or 5 years here in Norway that, and I think more or less globally, that youngsters are really getting interested in wanting to learn about growing their own and being self-sufficient again and stuff. And it's and permaculture is very, very important in that respect. And so about 5 years ago, youngsters started turning up in my garden. I heard rumors of this large collection of edible plants that I have, and started coming into my garden and saying, "You've got a forest garden." Have I? Of course I had a forest garden when I started thinking about it, because I have my garden is quite a complicated. There are lots of niches in the garden, ecological niches. There are shady places, there are open places, there are windy places. And I always, when I planted something, I planted according to where those plants would grow in nature. So I observed nature and moved those and planted according to that. So yeah, plants that needed shady conditions, they were planted together with trees and bushes. So yeah, of course I had a forest garden. I just didn't actually. Well, I had heard of the concept of forest gardening, but it didn't really totally sink in. I must admit, I was kind of doing my own thing for many years. I had read the book by Robert Hart years ago on forest gardening, one of the pioneers. Yeah, so that's where we are today, really.
You say about 5 years ago people were showing up in your garden. Had you had much exposure to the permaculture community before that?
Not really, no. I'd heard of permaculture, and I'd found it somewhat, I suppose, a bit confusing as to what exactly it was. I mean, I've been part of the organic movement, right from the word go. Actually, even before I moved to Norway, I was involved in the UK organic movement, what was called the Henry Doubleday Research Association at that time, and learned a lot about seed saving and the importance of preserving old varieties, genetic resources, and that kind of stuff. So as well, and I opened my garden to the public and had regular open days from about 89 onwards. So I always grew things organically, but the interest in perennials, it just gradually dawned on me that actually the plants which were giving the highest yields in my conditions, they were actually perennials. Okay, these were plants that were mainly harvesting in the springtime, like most of the wild edibles. But undoubtedly, it's the perennials that give the highest yields in my garden. And I started getting a Permaculture magazine with the publishers who are permanent publications, and I discovered a number of very interesting things, interesting plants, which weren't very well known as edibles around the world. And one of them was a plant that we call the Caucasian spinach, Hablitzia tamnoides. It's a climbing plant that can grow to about 3 to 4 meters during the summer months, and it grows in woodland in the Caucasus in the wild. And that plant came to Scandinavia as an ornamental in around about 1870, and it became quite popular over here. A bit popular. It was also grown in a small scale in the US and in England, but never became really popular. But particularly in Sweden, Finland, and Norway, it was discovered that it was actually the young shoots in the springtime were actually quite tasty. It's a plant which is related to plants like fat hen or what's it called? Lady's thumb, I think it's called over there, isn't it? No, not lady's thumb. Different cultures, different names, but it's in the Chenopodium family. So it's quite closely related to those. And yeah, it was discovered quite early on that it was very good to eat, but it kind of gradually, the interest in it as an ornamental, it kind of faded away. But a few people kept growing it as an edible. And when I discovered this about 15 years ago or so, I started growing it, and I found that it was getting incredible yields very early in the spring. So my oldest single plant, it has something like 250 shoots in the springtime from the one rootstock. And these shoots are harvested about 10 centimeters long. And you can cut them all back, and it comes with a new burst of growth. Really high yielding, very tasty. It can be used as a salad plant, and it can also be used as a kind of a spinach. And I was so excited about this plant, I wanted to kind of spread the word. So I contacted Permaculture magazine in the UK and asked them if they'd be interested in an article, and they were. I wrote the article, and I followed that up with another article about hostas, which is a very, very common ornamental plant, but little known in the West as an edible. Very important in the Far East, particularly in Japan and Korea, as an edible plant. It's cultivated, and it's also collected from the wild, foraged from the wild. Really productive plant. It grows in very shady conditions. Perfect for the forest garden type environment, but really, really strange that it's never really, despite all the books on oriental vegetables, etc., it doesn't seem to really have been picked up on before. So basically, on the back of those two plant profiles, I like to go into depth on the plants and how they. Well, this is how the whole book is structured. It's an ethnobotanical travel log around the world. So we follow the plants and the stories behind the plants, and I get experience about how those plants are cultivated, how they're used in the kitchen. It's not a cookbook, but I include a few recipes sprinkled through to kind of inspire others. So it's really a book that will hopefully inspire others to look at some of these perennials and try them for themselves. And it's by no means certain that the 80 that I've chosen are the best for other people. It's supposed to inspire people to look at other perennials around the world. There are certainly hundreds still to be discovered which are out there. I'm still discovering interesting perennials in my garden.
And how many perennials do you currently have in your garden?
Too many, probably. I kind of joke that I'm actually a sick man. I've got collectomania. My dad, he collected stamps. I had to find something to collect, and it turned out to be edible plants. So I really don't know how many there are, but probably have in the region of 2,000 different edible plants from around the world, which is quite interesting, because one day I can go out and forage in Japan. The next day I can forage in North America. I can forage in Norway, but I've got far too much food, particularly in the springtime. So I don't manage to, by no means, eat everything every springtime, and there's some things I still haven't got around to eating. And I don't have many of each variety, and I'm trying very hard to concentrate on the ones which are really are these 80 and a few others. But it's very difficult to throw plants away, I find.
How much space do you have devoted to your garden to grow these plants in?
Oh, let's say it's the whole garden is something like 50 meters long by about 30 meters wide, and I cultivate probably about 2/3 of that. So it's about 1,000 square meters. That's
really not a lot of space for how much you're growing.
No, it's not. As I say, I don't have that many of each variety. I'm lucky that I've got pretty fertile soil. I'm living right next to the coast, so I've only used seaweed as a fertilizer for the last, getting on for 25, 30 years. So so it's all kind of locally sourced, and I rarely have any other input than the seaweed in the garden.
I don't handle metric well, being an American. I just converted that, and that's only about 10,000 square feet then that you're cultivating. A little under a quarter of an acre. That's pretty incredible.
It's quite incredible. I mean, I could get more yield out of it if I really concentrated on the plants which were really giving the highest yield. But I'm, 100% self-sufficient, at least in leafy greens. I mean, potatoes, that kind of thing. But I don't grow grains and that kind of thing, only on a very small scale. So I experimented a bit with perennial grains and things, but not on a big scale. I don't have space for that. So the book is basically about leafy greens. I decided to limit it at that. I don't concentrate on root crops, but I mention it where a leafy green can also be used as a root vegetable.
In your garden, do you include any animals of any kind?
No, I don't. No. So it's kind of, I grow it's kind of vegan, I suppose, because I don't use any animal manure. I don't, apart from my own, whatever I produce myself, I don't import any horse manure or whatever.
And you say that you and your wife were vegetarians when you made the move. Are you still vegetarian?
Almost. I do have some wild fish occasionally, but otherwise I'm vegetarian, yeah. Lacto, yeah.
I think it was Steve Solomon, the author of Growing When It Counts. I don't remember if that's the full title of the book. He referred to himself as a vegetarian because he ate primarily the vegetables that grew from his garden. And it sounds like you're very sufficient from your own garden, your own needs in that way.
I mean, there are all sorts of techniques, in the winter I've got a house with a cold basement where I store a lot of things. I sprout a lot of things in the winter, usually home-saved seed. The cellar itself, I actually move things like kales, perennial kales, Swiss chard, these kind of things down into the basement and plant them in earth. And even though the temperature's only a few degrees, probably currently about 5 degrees, new sprouts come, so I can actually harvest greens from the cellar during the winter. And there are actually some plants that I can actually harvest outside, like this Caucasian spinach, the Hablitzia, because that actually it's incredibly early. It actually sends up young shoots in the autumn, and those young shoots, they stand the whole winter unaffected by temperatures down to minus 20. In Finland, anywhere they can stand minus 30 centigrade. Quite an incredible plant. I made a salad with some shoots just the other day, actually. And some onions, particularly the North American nodding onion, Allium cernuum, which I also call Chicago onion in the book, because the name Chicago actually means, or is believed to mean onion in Native American language. And that was one of the first perennial onions that I grew. It is grown here as an ornamental, but it's really productive. It's beautiful. It's tasty. Grows very quickly. That's one that I would definitely have in my garden if I started off again. And that's also in the book. And I tell the story about the book, about the plant and Chicago and North America's most widespread onion. And it's what I call an edible ornamental. Fantastic plant.
Mentioning that this would be one of the plants that you would start off with if you were starting off again, what are some other kind of beginner plants that you would recommend people investigate in this edimental vein?
Well, I've already mentioned one. That's the Hablitzia. It depends what kind of climate you've got, ultimately. Obviously, the people listening in here are living all over the world. So it's not necessary that the ones which grow for me best are going to grow well there. But I know that Hablitzia is grown in all the colder parts of North America, and it's grown right down into France and Europe and England. So that's one. Hostas I would definitely have. I would have a plant, my most productive perennial vegetable is a plant which we call udo, which comes from Japan. It was under the Latin name of Aralia cordata, plant in the ginseng family, and it's herbaceous. In other words, it dies right back to the ground every autumn. It comes with new shoots, but it grows to 3 to 4 meters in my almost Arctic climate within the end of June. Incredible growth rate, and my largest plant has something like 30 shoots, which I harvest about 1 meter high. And in Japan, it's again both cultivated and also wild foraged. And they have a really one of the most unusual forms of gardening I've ever come across. That Tokyo is built on, and parts of Tokyo anyway, are built on a particular type of soil, which they can easily dig in. And they've made these big caverns under Tokyo where they move the roots of udo down, and they're sprouted. So the shoots from the udo roots underground in the complete darkness, they harvest them down there, and then they sell those shoots as a delicacy on markets around. But that plant has so many different uses. The young shoots are used. The young flower, what we could think of as broccolis, just before the flowers come out, are used widely in Japan as in tempura, if you know what tempura is. And yeah, it's a plant that both bees and butterflies and nature likes, birds like the little berries that come later on. Fantastic plant. And when people challenge me and say that, well, the reason we don't grow perennials is that they don't yield well, I just show them a photograph of my largest vegetable with towering over me. So that is definitely one I would suggest looking at. I know it's cultivated for Oriental markets in North America. They've started recently in the UK cultivating it and selling on markets in London. So it's obviously fairly well adapted to quite a wide range of climates. Yeah, I could go on and on. There are so many plants, as I say, hosta, hablitzia. Perennial kales, of course, if you've got the climate. Perennial kales are not that hardy, but if you've got the climate for them, well, even if you don't have the climate, you can actually take cuttings of perennial kales in the autumn and overwinter them inside, and then you've already got a head start in the springtime.
With the hostas, for somebody who's listening to this and looking outside and thinking about the hostas that are growing in their own yard, what parts of that plant are edible?
Well, the main part which is used are the young shoots in the springtime. You can imagine just before the leaves start folding out. I actually call them hostons. I don't know if you know these chicory chicons which are sold on supermarket, but they're sprouted in the wintertime and sold over here anyway. So I call them hostons in parallel with chicons. And so they're basically harvested, and they can be used as a kind of a spinach. I've made I remember first actually it was the North American Hosta Society. This is the thing that really got me to. I'm very careful with I don't try things until I'm absolutely sure, particularly when I think I'm the only person in the world that's ever tried this vegetable. But I read on the net an article about the North American Hosta Society had an annual meeting, and one of the members was I think from Japan, and he made a whole range of hosta dishes for this meeting, and they were kind of raving about it, and this was really good, and that really encouraged me to try it. And one of the dishes they made was something called hosta kopita, which was based on the Greek spinach pie, which is called spanakopita. Okay, and it's basically, if you just take a Greek spinach pie recipe and use hosta leaves instead, then you've got a delicious vegetable pie. But not only that, I've discovered that there are other species of hosta which are also blanched. They're grown in dark greenhouses for markets in Tokyo, which they actually call, literally translated from the Japanese, hosta icicles, because they're white, they're long and white. Also, the flower shoots are very crispy and tasty, and the flowers themselves can be used in salads in the summer.
Such an incredible variety from a plant that until I read your book and talked to you today, I didn't even know was edible.
Yeah, most people are surprised, I have people coming around my garden, they see I'm growing hostas, and they say, "You don't eat that, do you?" And they're kind of in disbelief. But yeah, indeed, and it's not at all bitter, a good taste. Yeah. Try it. I mean, there are no known poisonous substances in any of the hostas, so you can basically use any.
Have you ever gotten a little bit of a stomach upset from trying some of your new plants as you bring them into your garden and into your diet?
No, I can honestly say that I've never, apart from one particular occasion, which was actually a wild forage plant, and that was ostrich fern, fiddleheads. And we had an experience where we harvested from the wild, and I actually had a course over here where we went out foraging along a river, and we came back home. I told everybody that you're supposed to cook them for 10, 15 minutes just to be sure, because some of the places that these ferns are growing can be flooded during the winter, and there can be some nasty things coming with the floodwaters. It's difficult to clean the fiddleheads 100%. And I know there have been similar episodes in the US of people getting sick from eating fiddleheads which haven't been cooked. So that was the only occasion. I told everybody to cook for 10 minutes, but I came back too late, and the dinner had already been made, and the person who had eaten it hadn't heard this, and it had only been cooked briefly. I thought, well, this has never occurred in Norway before that anybody's been sick. It's probably all right, but that was a mistake.
That's still pretty incredible for everything that you've sampled, everything you've brought into your garden, and all these things that are a regular part of your diet, to have had but just one incident.
Yeah, but it's all about diversity. Often the problem is you eat too much of one thing. I never eat too much of one thing because I'm always using at least, often anyway, 10, 20, 30 different vegetables in a dish. And I think this diversity and seasonality of food is very much underestimated in our diets. And it's more fun as well,
Well, I look at how colorful the plate is on the cover of your book with the yellows and reds and blues and purples and all these things that on a normal American plate you very rarely see unless it's something that's been colored like that.
The cover of the book is a picture from my house of one of these diversity salads that I've become known for because a few years ago, having so many edibles in my garden, we had an open day and I decided we'd make a salad with as many different species of plant as possible. The first time I did this, we came up, it was about 340 different species, and the second time it was 538, which is still the world record. I don't think anybody's been mad enough to try. So that gave me the name Extreme Salad Man or the Mad Salad Man. So I kind of regularly over recent years have made these salads, often with 100 species. I'm not going to make one with 538 again because that took about 20 hours to put together and document, etc. But every year I usually have a special occasion where we make a really diverse salad, so that every mouthful you eat it, you get a new taste. And they're beautiful, as you say, decorated with flowers and other colourful. Like on the cover, there's these little blue chunks. That's actually a blue Congo potato. So diversity is my second name, I suppose.
And I appreciate the time that we've spent together today walking through your background and the book and this diversity of foods that we can integrate and even grow in such a small space. Before we draw the interview to a close, do you have any final thoughts for the listeners?
Well, what I would say really is hopefully if you do read my book, Around the World in 80 Plants, that certainly has succeeded if it has inspired some of you folks to observe nature yourselves and start exploring the incredible number of wild edibles out there. As I said earlier, there is absolutely certain there are many still to be discovered. There are many of these wild edibles which have been domesticated on a small scale around the world. Absolutely certain there are hundreds of others in the Japan, Korea area. In the Mediterranean countries, they've discovered 3,000 different edible plants just over the last 15 years because researchers started getting money to explore what people were eating after the Mediterranean diet was the fact that people living in mountain areas in the Mediterranean areas had a very low incidence of heart and lung disease. And a lot of the perennials that I'm growing and most other people are growing are actually little improved from the wild species. So I encourage very much people to join groups like there's a Facebook group, Plant Breeding for Permaculture, because I think even as amateurs we can actually achieve a lot if we work together. For example, there's a lot of work going on at the moment within trying to breed better perennial kales by crossing perennial kales with some of the more colourful modern kales, for example, hoping that the perenniality will be maintained. So this whole thing of open source breeding of perennials is something I think we can actually do communally, thanks to the internet, and we can have fun at the same time. So that would be basically what I would hope. But it's something that I haven't really had enough space or time myself to work too much on. I've got a number of projects on the go, but where I'm trying to breed new things.
Well, it's encouraging to walk through your book and read about all of the different plants, and also to connect with the broader communities that are involved in this. As you say, there are a lot of younger folks coming into this who are very interested and engaged, and I hope that we can together continue to improve on these plants and enjoy such a diversity in our diet and in our world. So thank you for being a part of this movement.
Well, thank you too. That's been really interesting. Yeah. It's been a long journey, but a very interesting and fun journey. And I'm not finished yet.
Will you add another 1,000 plants or more to your garden?
Well, I doubt that, but as I say, I'm trying to decrease rather than increase. But certainly there are a lot of new things. I mean, I'm still sowing something like 300 different perennials every year, so I'm not finished quite. No.
Well, certainly I'll stay in touch and we'll find out more about where your garden grows in the future.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah, anybody in Norway, please pop in.
Even if they're just there to visit?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as long as I'm home and got time, then. Actually, I'm traveling quite a lot. On the back of the book, I'm going to be in New Zealand in March, when I think this is broadcasting, from mid-March, and then I'm going to be actually coming over to the US to Oregon in September, late August, September. So, and hopefully also be at the International Permaculture Conference in UK also in September.
Thank you very much for joining me.
Okay. Yeah. Cheers. Yeah.
And that was Stephen Barstow, author of Around the World in 80 Plants. You can find out more about his work at edimentals.com. His book is available in North America from Chelsea Green Publishing, or in the UK and Europe from Permanent Publications. You'll find links to all of those in the show notes. What's incredible to me is that Stephen is growing so many different varieties on such a small amount of space, which echoes what I learned from my road trip to Virginia, and especially from Holly Brown, that we really can grow a lot of food in not a lot of land area. More so, what impressed me about Stephen's work is that he's doing it in such a northerly climate, less than 1/4 of an acre, or 1/10 of a hectare, with over 2,000 different plants at 64 degrees north latitude. I knew that was fairly far up relative to where I am in Pennsylvania, but didn't have a real understanding until I compared it to other cities and saw that this is the same latitude as Fairbanks, Alaska. I took this a step further and checked the Köppen-Geiger climate classification map and confirmed that where Stephen is corresponds with other northerly latitudes. Yet he's growing all these plants. It's just amazing. If you're interested in Stephen and his work, I am including a copy of this book, which I received from Chelsea Green, in the Traveling Permaculture Library Project. If you haven't joined that cycle of giving yet, email your name and address to Matt Winters, who is the new librarian for the project. You can reach him at librarian@thepermaculturepodcast.com. Regardless of where you live, you can grow some of your own food. You can use permaculture to design for your space and climate, and take steps towards self-sufficiency that creates a better world, whatever that may mean to you. You can move a few dollars from one system and into the systems that you want to intentionally support. If at any point along the way I can help you, get in touch. Call 717-827-6266 or email show@thepermaculturepodcast.com. I'm also continuing to look for opportunities to take the show on the road and to record more live in-person interviews and round tables. You can use that phone number or email address to get in touch if you would like to host or have someone in mind that I should reach out to. Finally, a few announcements before drawing this episode to a close. This show, as mentioned in the introduction, is completely listener-supported, so I need your help to keep the show on the air. The best way to do that right now is through recurring contributions with Patreon. You can find out more about that, as well as how far I am along in reaching some of my goals at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. If you are not in a place to give, that's fine. I'll keep on keeping on as long as I can, and you can always lend a hand with sharing this podcast with others by leaving a review on iTunes, your favorite podcast site. Share links with your friends. Reply to tweets or retweet anything that I post to Twitter, where I'm at PermacultureCST, or join in the conversations on Facebook, facebook.com/thepermaculturepodcast. From here, I have a class announcement for my friends and colleagues Wilson Alvarez and Ben Weiss. They're running a permaculture design course in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, beginning on April 25th, 2015, and running on weekends through October. Search for Downtown Harrisburg Permaculture Course on Facebook to find the events page and more information, or follow the link in the show notes. Coming up for the podcast, I have interviews with wildman Steve Brill on foraging, Peter Michael Bauer on rewilding, and I'll be sitting down with Jen Mendez of PermiKids.com to record a two-part interview. I'll interview her for the first half, which will appear on this show, and then she's going to interview me for the second half that will appear on her podcast. I think that's going to be a fun time. And if you listen to the recent re-release of The Gift, with Matt Winters with a new introduction and ending, I'm looking to go back through the archives and do more of those best of episodes to share some of the more popular guests in new ways. There's 5 years of material sitting there, and I know that some of it gets lost if you just want to go looking for it. But there are some things that I think that all of us should listen to at least once, or time and again. But that covers everything for now. Until the next time, spend each day creating a better world, the world you want to live in, by taking care of Earth, yourself, and each other.